G'day guys, Dean from Blog for the Blood God here, and with the recent release of the World Eaters Codex, there's several rules interactions that are going to require an FAQ or some form of clarification. And what I wanted to do today is take one of those and break it down with you guys, see if we can solve this challenge in the comments section below, and if we can't, at least hopefully we can get this on GW's radar and get them to resolve it for us. I call this one the Angron Paradox because it's very similar in nature to the Grandfather Paradox, which is a paradox in time travel with causation and the basically sequencing of events. And I think this Angron situation has a lot of the same markers. So with that being said, let's get stuck into today's video and let's see if we can sort this one out, shall we?
Welcome to the Blood God.
G'day guys, I've got a nice interesting one for you today. I call this episode the Angron Paradox. So basically the World Eaters Codex is out now, we've all got it in our hands. I haven't yet because I'm waiting for the delivery, but it's out there in the world. We know what the rules are and there's some really exciting stuff in there. However, there's one really interesting interaction with Angron and the way his rules work with the blood tithe. And I think this is a pretty close parallel to the Grandfather Paradox, which is why I'm calling this episode the Angron Paradox. And so for those of you who don't know, the Grandfather Paradox is essentially a time travel theory where if you were to go back in time and kill your grandfather, your parents wouldn't be born and therefore you wouldn't be born, and therefore you wouldn't be able to go back in time to kill your grandfather, which would mean that you would be born and your parents would be born, which would mean that you would be able to go back in time to kill your grandfather. But if you did, you wouldn't be born and you go around and around and around, right? So it's this essentially a causality paradox. Now, the World Eaters Codex brings a similar situation with Angron. Basically, the way this works is when Angron dies, he generates blood tithe points, right? So he's going to generate one blood tithe points for being a unit that died. And at the end of the phase, he's also going to generate an additional one for being a character / monster that died. So you're going to generate 2 blood tithe points when Angron dies. But the interesting thing is when you spend 6 blood tithe points, you can bring Angron back to life, and it specifically states that he no longer counts as having been destroyed. So the question is, if you do that, do you keep the blood tithe points that you generated? Because when he dies, he generates blood tithe points. However, if you spend those blood tithe points to resurrect him, he no longer counts as having been destroyed, which would mean that you wouldn't generate the blood tithe points, which would mean that you wouldn't be able to resurrect him, which would mean that he would remain dead, in which case you would generate the blood tithe points, and so on and so forth. So a little bit of an interesting paradox there, which GW probably should step in and clear up. And this is also similar with your opponent scoring secondaries and stuff. So that's why it's important that they solve this, because if your opponent kills Angron and therefore generates assassination points, but then after the fact you resurrect Angron and he no longer counts as having been destroyed, well, do they keep those assassination secondary points, or do they lose them? And if they lose them, you know, like, how does this all work? It's a bit messy. I believe that the correct way to do this will be that he generates the blood tithe points at the end of the phase, right? Immediately when he dies, and then he generates additional ones at the end of the phase when he, for the fact that he's a monster / character. So at that point, you generated the blood tithe points because he was destroyed, and then at the point that you resurrect him, from then onwards, he no longer counts as having been destroyed. So you still keep those blood tithe points, and importantly, if your opponent got bring it down points off him or something to that effect, they would also keep those points. So I think that's the way it would work. And then basically from the point of you generating the resurrection, spending the points on resurrection, from that point onwards, he's not destroyed. But if they destroy him again, then you get the blood tithe points again, and they get their assassinate points again. And then from that point onwards, he doesn't count as destroyed. Now, the reason that this is important is there's really important timing. So you can spend the blood tithe points to resurrect him at the end of any phase. And things like assassinate and bring it down are scored at the end of the battle round, right? So it's very important that you spend your command points to resurrect him at the appropriate time. So let's say you go first, you fly Angron up the table. Your opponent was smart, they deployed everything far out of his range, so you've flown Angron up into the middle of the table. Maybe he's jumped on that central objective, and then you go into your opponent's turn and they shoot him dead, right? So in their shooting phase, they kill him, right? So what you want to do is you want to wait until the end of the phase and go, cool, you killed him, I generate a blood tithe point. And then at the end of their phase, you go, cool, I generated an additional blood tithe point because you killed a monster. And then you go, cool, so I've generated my 2 blood tithe points. Then, and that was in their shooting phase. Then in their fight phase, you would then go, cool, I'm actually going to spend my 6 blood tithe points now in the fight phase to bring Angron back. So I spent my blood tithe points, I generated them, I have now in a separate phase spent them, I keep the blood tithe point are all good, I bring him back, he's now in strategic reserves, then we go to the end of the battle round and they don't score their assassinate, because at this stage in the timeline, Angron does not count as having been destroyed. So even though they did destroy him during the turn, he was not counting as destroyed at the point that they would generate victory points. But he did count as destroyed at the point in which you generate blood tithe points. So navigating this is going to be tricky, and I think there's going to be a lot of instances where we're going to have arguments on the tabletop because people are not going to agree with this interpretation. And I fully invite people to give their interpretations in the comments section below. Let me know what you guys think. But as far as I can see, based on the way that the rule is written, this is how it would work. You would generate the blood tithe points when he dies, and because there's no way of knowing whether or not you're going to resurrect him, right? So you generate the blood tithe points, they're yours. You could spend them on other things. You could spend them on scoring your victory points, because you can sacrifice blood tithe points for victory points, so you could do that. There's all kinds of things you could do with them. So you generate them, they're yours. You can do what you want, right? But then at a later stage, if you spend blood tithe points to resurrect him, they can't then go back and take away blood tithe points that you spent on other things. So basically when you generate them, they're yours for keeps, and then when you spend them to resurrect him, well, now he's back, and from that point onwards, he no longer counts as having been destroyed. So making sure that you time that well is very important. You don't want to do it in the same phase that he dies, because then you're not going to generate the blood tithe point at the end of the phase if it's your opponent's turn, because they would choose the sequence. So you want to go, cool, I'm not going to do it at the end of the phase, I'm going to do it in the following phase. I think a general rule of thumb is going to be, if you're going to resurrect Angron, just do it in the morale phase every game, every turn. Because then it's always going to be before the end of the battle round, which means it's always going to prevent your opponent from scoring victory points. But it's never going to prevent you from generating the victory points from him being destroyed. So I think that's the best way to do it going forward. But let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you think this paradox needs to be solved, or if you think the rules are clear enough. Let me know if you think I've got this interpretation wrong, and if I have, well, then that tells me that it very clearly needs to be FAQ'd because I've got it wrong, and there will be others that will also get it wrong. So if I'm wrong, then it definitely needs an FAQ, but if you agree with me, maybe it doesn't, and maybe, maybe it's a little bit easier to comprehend than I'm giving it credit for. But either way, let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and as always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Blood to the Black God!